Today we're going to start with Section 4, titled the Constitution. And this is something we're not going to go into crazy amount of detail on what the Constitution does and all the kind of rules and the significance of it. And the reason I'm not going to do that is because next year, POD, you're going to spend at least one quarter talking about specifically what the Constitution is, who has what power, why they're able to do that, and kind of things along those lines. So anyways, this is going to be kind of an introduction into the Constitution. And it's important because just about everything we're going to talk about with politics, with what the Congress is going to do, all that is going to be based upon the Constitution. And you're going to hear a lot of people say, well, that's unconstitutional. We'll kind of talk about some of the things and why that phrase is thrown out there quite a bit. So anyways, before the war was over, most states, I shouldn't say most states, every state had a new constitution. And they did this because they wanted to make sure that they had something set up that was smart, was logical for them, and would make sure that they had the government that they wanted. And I don't know if it was fear or whatever you want to call it, but they were afraid of having another tyranny. They were afraid of becoming another Great Britain. So these states, they are going to start to have what we call a separation of power among the branches. And the British, they kind of have this where, today if I say, what can the Queen do? There's not really a lot. The Queen can't just necessarily make a law because she wants to. Now, there are certain stipulations, like the Queen, if she wants to drive as fast as she can, that's 100% legal. But we want to have that separation of powers. So one example I hear a ton of students saying is, I just heard the president declared war. Well, first off, the president can't do that. That's based upon separation of powers. So the separation of powers, really what it boils down to is they want to make sure that each of these branches, they are going to have their own powers, they aren't going to become too powerful, and they're all going to kind of work together for the common goal of the United States. So that's going to be what most of these states' constitutions are going to start to do. They are also going to start to relax a lot of those voting rules or voting laws. And when I say that, it was still segregated. African Americans still were not able to vote. Women still were denied political rights. But white men, if you paid taxes, you were able to vote. Before it used to be you had to own property, because if you didn't own property, well, unfortunately, they kind of looked down upon you at that point. But anyways, things are starting to change. White males, as long as they paid taxes, could vote. Still, a lot of people are denied those political rights, but it is starting to kind of have that upswing there. And then lastly, emancipation is starting to become an issue in the North. And when I say emancipation, that is the start or the end goal of ending slavery. Now, a lot of people in the North, they supported this, but the South, they're going to fight it really, really hard. And as I say that, knowing we went to war, not specifically for that, but that was going to be kind of one of the underlying factors here. So anyways, new state constitutions, every single state's going to have them. They want to have that separation of powers. They want to make sure that one group isn't going to become too powerful. Now, I talked about the state constitutions. They still are going to create their own federal government. But the federal government they create, not going to work. It's viewed as almost like a major failure. And I would almost kind of argue against that for the simple fact that because they created this, what we call the Articles of Confederation, it did kind of get us to where we have the Constitution that we have today. So, as I brought up, this national government, it's going to be known as the Articles of Confederation. And I already brought up the idea of fear. This one was very, very dependent upon that fear. Because they did not want to have a king, they did not want to have a dictator, they did not want to have a tyranny. So they create a government that is going to very loosely unify the states. Now, one big issue, each state was only given one vote. Now, smaller states, they 100% they support that. Bigger states, they don't think it's right. They don't think it's fair. And you almost kind of look at today, well, what do we have? Today we have a mixture of both of those. And they say the House of Representatives, here in North Dakota, we only have one member of the House of Representatives. That's because it's based on population. Senate, every state has two. So even though California has millions upon millions of more people living there, in the Senate we are still the same at 2 and 2. But each state was going to be given one vote on those issues. And that's going to be kind of one of the first things that the larger states are going to start to fight and why they want to start to have a different federal government. Now let's talk about the pros. The pros, they could declare war. I don't know if you really call that a pro, saying that we have a declaration of war, but it's really just done to make sure that if we do have a war, every state is going to be joining and is going to be a part of it. They are also going to kind of be able to raise an army. So they can declare war, they can raise an army, but that's where it's going to stop there. for the pros. Now the negatives. And I have two on there. There's a lot more. But the biggest two negatives, the first one, there's no separate branches of government. And as I talked about with the state constitutions, most of them, they have an executive branch. So if we're talking about state government, executive branch, that's the governor. They have a legislative branch. Second part. So here in North Dakota, we call that the Legislative Assembly. We have the House of Representatives. We have the Senate. Both of them have to approve laws. We have the judicial branch. We have the Supreme Court, both at the federal level and at the state level. But the Articles of Confederation, just one branch of government. And people don't like that. They also could not impose taxes. And I know you're probably thinking, like, why is that a negative? If you had the option to not pay taxes, I'm willing to say a lot of you would raise your hand. But why this is important, taxes, it pays for roads. It pays for our defense. It pays for education. Now, by saying, okay, we need $10 million, who's willing to chip in? Well, most of those states aren't going to be able to do that. So that's going to be why it's considered to be a weak national government there. Now, through all that, they were able to pass the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And really all it does, that's a plan for selling and governing this new land west of the Appalachians. But from that, as I said, people view it as a failure. I think in a way it's kind of a positive because it gets us to this next point where we are going to have the federal Constitution. Now, just to kind of talk about a couple of things about what the Constitution, some of the big principles, what the big things that were done there. The first one is checks and balances. And it's kind of like the idea of that separation of powers. Separation of powers means we're not going to have just an executive branch. We're going to have executive, we're going to have legislative, we're going to have judicial. Checks and powers is set up to make sure that one branch does not become too powerful. So we have three branches. You could argue that one branch is more important, one more, I guess, has more power than the others, but they're all supposed to work together. And I'll use the example of a law. Now, laws, those are created in the legislative body. So somebody, we'll talk about a member of the House of Representatives right now, who's Kevin Cramer. Kevin Cramer is going to say, I want to create a new law, goes and talks about it in Congress. They pass it in the House, pass it in the Senate. Does that give Congress too much power? That's where people have to kind of draw that line and try to figure out if that is too much power. So anyways, why, I guess, is viewed as not too much power? The president, he has to sign the law. So say, They do pass that law, it gets to the president, he doesn't like it, he is able to veto it at that point. Now you're probably thinking, does that give him too much power? And while they wrote the Constitution, they said absolutely. Giving one person the power to turn down any law that they want, yeah, that's going to be too much of maybe a dictatorship or a tyranny. So they are able to veto legislation. But Congress can overturn it by a 2/3 vote, 2/3 majority. Now, the Supreme Court oftentimes is people kind of see as like the forgotten branch. And early on when D.C., once they set that up as the nation's capital, the Supreme Court didn't even have their own building. If they had to make a decision, they got on horseback and they went to Virginia, they went to Connecticut, went to New Jersey to make that decision. But the Supreme Court, they can make a law unconstitutional. So Congress approve it, President approve it, they can say, nope, federal Constitution, that's not how we see that. So they are able to make a law unconstitutional at that point. So that's kind of that idea of checks and balances, making sure one branch is not going to become too powerful than the other ones. Now, amending the Constitution. This will be the last one we do today. Now, the framers, which is often when we talk about the people who created the Constitution, we call them the framers. Now, the framers realized that this document, it has to change. You know, looking at what the Second Amendment means back then in 1787 versus today, it is so much different. So they came up with an idea, they came up with a way to change the Constitution, and that's going to be what's known as an amendment. We have 27 of them today, so we have 27 changes to the Constitution. Now, an amendment can be proposed by a vote of 2/3 of both chambers of Congress. That's going to be the first way. Usually that's the only way that's going to be done. They say we want to create this new law. I'll think about one. We'll talk about Prohibition, the 18th Amendment. In the 1920s, they wanted to make it illegal for you to buy, to sell, produce, or consume alcohol. So, went to Congress, they support it, it then goes back to the states. Now, to take a step back, 2/3 of the states also could call a constitutional convention. So 2/3 have to say we want this, to be added to the Constitution. It's a little bit harder, a little bit more difficult for that to be done. But no matter what, how it starts, it all finishes the same way. 3/4 of the states have to ratify it before it becomes law. And you probably think, well, this could probably be pretty easy to do. 2/3 in the House and the Senate, 3/4 of the state. Not that simple. As I said, we have 27 of them. Millions upon millions have been proposed, but only 27 of them have passed. So to wrap it up, just a quick summary of the Constitution. We started with the Articles of Confederation. It was viewed as kind of weak, not really given too much power. They were fearful of creating this new tyranny. From that, they realized, and it was Washington kind of spearheaded this movement, that we needed to have a federal, maybe not constitution, but we need to have a new government. They got together, came up with the Constitution, but they passed it. Still has to go back to the states. It's almost like the idea of that amending the Constitution. 3/4 of the states have to ratify it before it is going to become our government.